This is Up. I'm David Gura, and this week, on the day known as Juneteenth, Americans marked the end of slavery in this country. President Trump, who launched his campaign with a speech in which he called Mexican rapists, threatened to round up immigrant families for deportation by the millions. And the last minute, he canceled those plans after he promised, quote, the cleanest border there is. There was news this week about deplorable conditions in detention facilities in this country, not visible to the public. In court, a government lawyer argued it should not be held responsible for providing toothbrushes or soap to migrant children. And as President Trump formally kicked off his bid for re-election, groups of white supremacists marched in the streets of Orlando where the rally was held. Reporters asked the president about a moment that defines how we understand President Trump's perspective on race. Netflix has a new series on the Central Park Five, and reporters asked him if he wanted to apologize for what he said about the group in the past. And for this ad, he took out in New York newspapers calling for the death penalty.
Why do you bring that question up now? It's an interesting time to bring it up. You have people on both sides of that. They admitted their guilt. If you look at Linda Fairstein and if you look at some of the prosecutors, they think that the city should never have settled that case. So we'll leave it at that.
Both sides-ism there along the lines of what we heard after what happened in Charlottesville. Reparations is something the candidates are talking about on the campaign trail, and it was also the subject of a congressional hearing on Capitol Hill. Well, this is what the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, had to say about that.
Reparations for something that happened 150 years ago for whom none of us currently living are responsible is a good idea. We've, tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president. I think we're always a work in progress in this country.
Well, one of the witnesses at that hearing on reparations addressed those remarks from the Senate Majority Leader directly.
Thing about Senator McConnell's something. It was 150 years ago, and it was right now. The typical black family in this country has 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family. Black women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of white women. And there is, of course, the shame of this land of the free, boasting the largest prison population on the planet, of which the descendants of the enslaved make up the largest share.
I should say Republicans were not the only politicians facing criticism this week. Democratic presidential candidate and Mayor Pete Buttigieg canceled a campaign appearance to return to his home in South Bend, Indiana, after a white police officer shot and killed a black man.
You ask me if Black Lives Matter?
Yes, we want to hear you say it.
Of course, Black Lives Matter.
Then fire your car. What matters about a black life to you, Mayor Pete? What matters about a black life to you? Answer that for in just
Same thing that matters to me about my own.
And former Vice President Joe Biden finally responded to criticism of remarks he made about working with segregationist senators.
I do understand the consequence of the word boy, but it wasn't said in any of that context at all.
But you understand, they would call you son. They would never call me son. They would only call me boy.
No, but they called Teddy Kennedy boy. That was the distinction. The reason he called me senator was trying to demean me more because son, because he said, I'm not even qualified to be in the Senate. I'm not old enough. And to the extent that anybody thought that I meant something different, that is not what I intended.
A Week in America, 2019. With us this hour, Washington Post national correspondent Phillip Bump, Fordham University Associate Professor of Political Science, and the author of Black Ethnics, Christina Greer, Bloomberg News Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli, and with us from Columbia, South Carolina, Jason Johnson. He is a political editor for TheRoot.com. He's also an MSNBC political contributor. Christina, I lay it all out there. Help us put it all together. Help us put it into context, what we saw over the course of this last week.
This is reminiscent of the disastrous Black History Month we had, where it was just assault after assault from the president. We're just weakening sort of the celebration that I think many Americans, especially black Americans, wanted to have in February. And so, unfortunately, this is our political reality. We have a president who has always exhibited, I would say, racist tendencies. Some people argue with that sort of dichotomy, but we know that he took out an ad about the Central Park Five. We know he won't apologize. We know what he said after Charlottesville. We know that he is very cozy with people who do have explicit racist tendencies, and we know who he surrounded himself with in his administration. So we're at a moment right now where this isn't just about black Americans feeling a certain way about the president. We are in the middle of having children in concentration camps, and this president and his administration do not see them as human, And that's just where we are. And we're supposed to go about our daily business thinking that we have to still respect and honor the office of the presidency, but we are not dealing in normal times. And so there's a certain level of anger, frustration, and fear that a significant portion of Americans have because we have a president who just does not respect borderline 50% of the country, if not more. And to put it all in context about reparations and the struggles with the Democratic Party primaries and who will emerge as someone who could actually beat Donald Trump if he chooses to leave office, if he's defeated, and that's a whole nother segment that we'll get to. I'm just, as a political scientist, when we look at some of the data that's coming out that's, I think, ill-informed in some ways, I am trying to stay optimistic, but it's increasingly more and more difficult with this president and the people who are supporting him, and especially certain Democrats who don't seem to understand the explicit threat that he poses, because he doesn't pose an explicit threat to them, per se, because of their race or their class status. And so they're still trying to sort of buddy up to him in ways that don't exist in 2019.
Phillip Bump, let me pull two strands there. Let's look at them in complement. And that is the reporting that was done by the Times and the AP about this detention facility in Clint, Texas, the deplorable conditions in that facility, and what we heard from the president about the prospect for these raids taking place across the country, these ICE raids. How do you see the two of them in complement? And now, a year after the end of the family separation policy, where do we stand when we look at this issue of immigration?
Yeah, it was actually a year ago this morning. I was looking at President Trump's Twitter feed, and a year ago this morning he was trumpeting how Barack Obama had these same immigration facilities.
Inherited separation,
exactly.
He's called it, yeah.
And he made the same claim to Chuck Todd in his interview that's airing today. This is all part of President Trump's rhetoric, right? I mean, you made the point that when he launched his campaign, he said, you know, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending the best, they're sending rapists and drug dealers. And he has put a lot of weight on but some of them are fine people, which of course we realize is not the real message. The real message was, these people are a threat, these people are a risk, I will be your salvation. And this is, he has formally entered his re-election campaign this week, but obviously he's been running since 12:01 p.m. on January 20th, 2017, right? And what he's trying to do is he's trying to reinforce that core message that there is still this dangerous threat that exists coming from Mexico. He now has these numbers of apprehensions at the border, a lot of which is driven by people seeking asylum, which is, of course, a completely legal process. But he points to these numbers and he points to what's going on as evidence for the need to re-elect him because there is still this ongoing threat. At the same time, he is also sending a message by having a Department of Homeland Security which approaches young people, approaches children, and approaches immigrants who have been arrested in a way that shows that there is not a lot of money being spent on them. Right? And there's a lot of ways to read into that. But obviously one of the messages that can be taken from that is that these people are not worthy of being treated as you would, if Ivanka Trump were in prison, I don't think she would be treated the same way.
Jason Johnson, when you look at that exchange between the president and those reporters at the White House on the Central Park Five, a number of things stand out. His lack of, I guess, cultural sophistication. He seemed unaware of the fact that there was this Netflix series taking place, seemed surprised that the question would come up now. But when you hear him refusing to apologize, when you hear that both sidesism, what is that emblematic of? Is it just that adamance that he doesn't apologize for anything, or is it something greater? What does it exemplify to you?
The president's a white nationalist. I mean, I've made that clear. The president is a white nationalist. His vision of America is a country for Christian white people, where people who are not Christian and not white do not have a strong lever when it comes to economics or culture or politics. He's made that abundantly clear, and that's not that hard to figure out. But I'm going to also say this, David, not just as a journalist at the Root, but also as a political science professor myself. I have to drop this because Christy said it, so Ms. Greer, Dr. Greer, I have to mention it too. Yeah, I had to mention it. I'm here in South Carolina for the South Carolina Democratic Party convention. You had 15, 20 or so candidates who happened to come down here and they spoke. I went to the spot where Bree Newsom climbed up a flagpole and pulled down the Confederate flag. Only one or two of the candidates who came here and spoke this weekend made reference to that historic act. And even fewer made reference to the fact that it took 9 people being assassinated in a church during Bible study for the government here to think that it was a problem to have a Confederate flag commemorating that kind of violence sitting at a state-sponsored state house. That is what we're talking about here. Everything this week, from the shooting of a possibly unarmed black man in South Bend, to Donald Trump not apologizing for giving aid and comfort to white nationalists, to Joe Biden trying to explain to everybody how he knows better and he knows what black people should think about how he speaks. It speaks to the endemic white supremacy and white nationalism that infuses almost every single aspect of our government and our economy. And from a pure political standpoint, from a pure campaign strategy standpoint, if these Democrats don't get it together with their rhetoric and their policies, they're going to lose black voters in 2020, and Donald Trump is going to stay in office.
Kevin Cirilli, we're going to come back and talk more about this reparations debate in a little bit, but I want you to reflect on what you heard from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell there about this issue and the degree to which the topic of race is imbuing all politics today. We're talking about this one week in particular, but this is obviously a much larger issue saturating so much.
Well, look, I think the question for the Democratic presidential candidates is, when are they going to talk about policies? And I think that the upcoming debate in Miami is an opportunity for former Vice President Joe Biden to really talk about his record, during the civil rights movement, to talk about his record with the LGBTQ community, to talk about his time in the Obama White House. And quite honestly, I think that he got that conversation started with Reverend Al Sharpton, and I think you're going to see that as a continuation. I also think, and look, it's so tough to talk about these issues through the lens of like political consultants. I mean, it does feel, for lack of a better word, inauthentic. But when I talk to Democratic political strategists, quietly they say that some of these Democratic presidential candidates who are, maybe overplaying their hand in their critiques against former Vice President Joe Biden. I was struck by what Congressman some members of the Congressional Black Caucus said earlier this week when they defended Biden. And I think that you saw that from Clyburn within the past 48 hours. And I think that there's an honest, raw, authentic conversation that's being had, and ultimately, I think it's going to shift back to policy.
Christina, I want to pick up on that word.
Yeah.
Kevin's using the word authentic, and I noted it several times this week as you heard politicians in the Congressional Black Caucus or House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying, when she was talking about Vice President Joe Biden, she said, "We like authentic politicians," and we were seeing the authenticity of Joe Biden. Help me definitionally with that term.
Well, I mean, we know that every party chooses a buzzword weekly, and so that's the word of the week. I mean, I think a memo literally goes out. It's like this week
like the last 4 years.
Right, exactly.
It's been longer than a week, my friend.
So, but, since Jason's here, I have to sort of quote the great Charles Hamilton of 1973 when he really talks about black politics, and this is the tension we see with black voters, but also black electeds, this idea of the protectionist phase versus the advancement phase. And I think we have quite a few people in the Congressional Black Caucus who see Joe Biden with this 40-year record where he's done lots that he should be proud of and that we should be proud of as a nation. He's been a very faithful public servant, but there are many things that, unfortunately, in 2019, they just don't hold up. And so you have elected officials who are saying, well, he's good enough and he can beat Trump, hopefully, so let's stay in the protectionist phase. Then you have other people who are like, you know what? There are just way too many strikes on his record. Let's move forward with someone whom we don't know. However, the advancement phase for a new type of black politics in the 21st century, we're still using old models, and a lot of voters just don't think it's enough, right? There are many people in South Carolina who were just saying, well, the flag is on the top of the, the State House. That's just the way it is. That's South Carolina. And you have people like Bree Newsom and a new generation who were saying, you know what? It's past time for that to come down, and we're over it.
Right, but Joe Biden never said that.
Joe Biden didn't say a lot of things, and that's part of the problem. Because he's going to try, he's the Hillary problem. He's going to try and run on the Barack Obama was my best friend, clean, shiny, and articulate Barack Obama, right? And so all the ills that befell the Obama administration, he has to own those too, and that's what Hillary Clinton struggled with when she ran.
Dr. Johnson, lastly to you here.
Right. And I have to say this. I don't care what Joe Biden meant. What matters is what he said. This is a campaign environment where you have to take responsibility for your words. And I'll add this to Mayor Pete. When Mayor Pete said in that video that we've seen lots of videos where he's like, he's talking to sort of angry protesters. He's like, look, I'm not here for your vote. I understand that Mayor Pete was saying, I am here because this is a police violence issue. I'm not here as a campaign stop. But as a candidate, it is your responsibility to explain until the voters understand it. And you can't go lecturing them, because I don't know anybody who's ever won a campaign by saying, you're too dumb to understand what I meant, and still ends up winning at the voting booth. These guys need to step up their game if they want to win black voters.
We're going to leave it there. Dr. Jason Johnson, thank you very much for sticking around. Appreciate the time on this Sunday morning. And coming up, the